Did you know that over 70% of rock legends fell into addiction, and many never made it out alive? From Jimi Hendrix setting his guitar on fire to GG Allin turning concerts into riots. Here are 25 famous rock stars destroyed by substances. 1. Jimi Hendrix. He changed music forever. Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix wasn't just a musician. He played his guitar like no one else, making it cry, scream, or whisper. His performances were electric, full of energy. He set his guitar on fire at Monterey and played the national anthem in a way no one had ever heard at Woodstock. But while his music soared, his life was falling apart. Fame brought stress, and Hendrix turned to substances and alcohol to cope. LSD made his mind expand, but it also made reality slip away. Sleeping pills became a habit, but instead of helping him rest, they pulled him into a dangerous cycle. His mood swung wildly, and paranoia crept in. By 1970, constant touring and legal troubles pushed him to his limit. He relied on strong sleeping pills, not knowing they would end his life. On September 17, 1970, Hendrix took a heavy dose of barbiturates and washed them down with wine. He never woke up. His breath stopped in his sleep. The world lost a music legend just as he was exploring new sounds. 2. Kurt Cobain. He became the voice of a generation that felt lost and angry. Kurt Cobain's music wasn't just noise. It spoke for people who felt ignored. Songs like Smells Like Teen Spirit shook the world, but behind the scenes, Cobain was struggling. Fame crushed him. Chronic stomach pain tormented him. Opiates became his escape. At first, the substance dulled his pain, but soon it controlled him. As Nirvana became more famous, Cobain sank deeper into addiction. He missed shows, overdosed, and scared those who cared about him. Interventions didn't work. A near-fatal overdose in Rome should have been a wake-up call, but it only pushed him further down. In his final days, he shut himself away. He ran from rehab and locked himself in his Seattle home. On April 5, 1994, he took a lethal dose of opiates. A shotgun ended his life. Days later, they found his body. 3. Jim Morrison. He was more than a singer. Jim Morrison was a poet with a voice that could shake people. The Doors made music that was different, mixing deep lyrics with hypnotic sounds. But Morrison wasn't just about music. He was always searching, using words, songs, and substances to push the limits of reality. Alcohol became his biggest problem. It turned him from a powerful performer into someone who slurred his words and stumbled on stage. Harder substances made things worse. Even as the Doors became more famous, Morrison was already falling apart. He moved to Paris to escape fame, but addiction followed. His body got weaker, and his nights grew darker. On July 3, 1971, he was found lifeless in a bathtub. His girlfriend Pamela said he had been coughing up blood the night before. The official cause of death was heart failure, but many believe opiates played a role. 4. Janis Joplin. She didn't just sing. Janis Joplin poured her soul into every note. She sang with fire, pain, and a deep longing that couldn't be silenced. Born in Texas in the early 1940s, she never fit in. She was wild and different in a world that wanted her to be like everyone else. The blues became her escape. She listened to Bessie Smith and Lead Belly, learning to growl, wail, and scream like they did. Joplin turned to whiskey and opiates, the only things that never left her. Friends tried to help, but addiction had its grip on her. In 1970, she was at her peak, recording her final album, Pearl. She talked about new love and better days ahead, but those days never came. One morning in October, she didn't show up for a recording session. They found her lifeless in a hotel room, a needle nearby. She was only 27. He did not just live, Bon Scott charged through life. His voice was rough, his smile meant trouble, and his energy was impossible to ignore. Born in the 1940s and raised in Australia, he never fit in. School bored him, the law could not control him. But music? That was different. By the 1970s, he was the voice of AC/DC, a band that made music for rule breakers. His wild voice powered songs like Highway to Hell and Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. He became a rock star. But behind the fun, trouble was growing. Scott drank like it was a competition. His bandmates worried. His body warned him. He ignored it all. Then, in February 1980, a cold London night and another round of heavy drinking. He passed out in a friend's car and never woke up. Cause of death? Alcohol poisoning. He was just 33. 6. Jerry Garcia. He was not just a guitarist. Jerry Garcia was the soul of a movement. A quiet, kind man whose fingers created magic on the guitar. Born in the 1940s, he found music early. The Grateful Dead became his family, a band that turned concerts into adventures, where every song was its own world. But the same freedom that made Garcia a legend also led him into danger. Substances were everywhere, and he welcomed them. Opiates became more than a habit. It controlled him. He thought it helped, but it was slowly destroying him. His body grew weak. The man fans adored was fading before their eyes. In the summer of 1995, Garcia checked into rehab, trying to escape his addiction. 1 week later, he was gone, a heart attack in his sleep. He was 53. The Grateful Dead continued in pieces, but the magic was never the same. His death was not just the loss of a musician, it was the end of an era. 7. Dee Dee Ramone. He was the wild heart of punk rock. Dee Dee Ramone's bass lines were fast, his lyrics honest, and his energy unstoppable. But behind the loud music and leather jackets, he fought battles he couldn't win. Born Douglas Colvin in the early 1950s, his childhood was a mess. He moved between Germany and the U.S., never feeling like he belonged. That loneliness stayed with him, pushing him toward music and addiction. By the time he co-founded the Ramones in the early 1970s, Dee was already hooked on opiates. He wrote many of the band's biggest hits, but off-stage, he was falling apart. He didn't hide his substance use. He sang about it, joked about it, and let it take over his life. His bandmates tried to help, but addiction was stronger. Missed rehearsals, reckless behavior, and unstable moods made him a problem. By the late 1980s, he left the Ramones and tried something new: rap music. No one took it seriously, not even him. Every failed attempt to move forward sent him deeper into his struggles. Rehab, relapse, repeat. That was his life. Even when the Ramones were honored in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he couldn't escape his demons. He tried to get clean, but the damage was done. In the summer of 2002, addiction won. At 50 years old, Dee Ramone was found lifeless in his Hollywood home, opiates in his veins one last time. 8. Sid Vicious. If punk had a face, it was Sid Vicious. He wasn't just a musician. He was a walking explosion, a mix of rage and recklessness. But behind the sneer and spiked hair, there was something much darker. Born John Ritchie in the late 1950s, his mother introduced him to substances before he had a chance to choose another path. His childhood was filled with instability and anger, setting him up for the chaos ahead. When he joined the Pistols in the late 1970s, he could barely play bass, but no one cared. His attitude was the real show. Fans saw a rebel. His bandmates saw a disaster waiting to happen. The substances, the aggression, the self-destruction, it was all part of the Sid Vicious image. And then came Nancy. Their love was a storm of fights, paranoia, and destruction. Addiction fueled every mistake, turning their story into a disaster waiting to happen. Nancy Spungen was toxic, and together she and Sid became a mess of addiction and chaos. Their hotel rooms were substance dens, their fights turned bloody, and their love story became a tragedy. In late 1978, the worst happened. Nancy was found stabbed in their New York hotel room. Sid was the main suspect, but he swore he didn't remember what happened. Maybe he didn't want to. While waiting for trial, he spiraled further, using more opiates than ever before. His arrest pushed him even deeper into the darkness, as if he had already given up. 9. Phil Lynott. Phil Lynott was a rock star people never forgot. His voice was smooth, his lyrics deep, and his stage presence electric. But the life he built was falling apart. Born in the late 1940s, he grew up in Dublin as one of the few black kids in a tough world. Music was his escape, and he became the leader of Thin Lizzy, a band that blended hard rock with Irish soul. For years, he ruled the stage. Songs like The Boys Are Back in Town and Jailbreak became classics. Fans loved him, but behind the scenes, he was losing a battle. The partying wasn't just fun, it became an addiction. Drink after drink, hit after hit, he was slipping away. By the early 1980s, Thin Lizzy was fading, and so was Phil. His body grew weak, his performances lost their fire, and the energy that made him a star was running out. Christmas of 1985 was the final blow. He collapsed at home, his body breaking after years of substance use. Rushed to the hospital, there was little doctors could do. Just days into the new year, he was gone. And at 36, one of rock's greatest songwriters played his last note. His voice was more than powerful. It was raw and full of pain. As the frontman of Alice in Chains, Lane Staley became a grunge legend, pouring his suffering into songs like Man in the Box and Down in a Hole. But while his voice reached millions, his addiction to opiates and stimulants took over his life. Unlike many rock stars, Staley didn't show off his wild lifestyle. Instead, he disappeared. The substances turned him into a ghost, shutting out friends and family. By the mid-1990s, his body was failing. The band's final shows revealed a man barely holding on. His strong stage presence was gone, replaced by a frail, broken figure. When his fiancée, Demry Parrott, died in 1996, it destroyed what little hope he had left. He vanished into a dark apartment ruled by addiction. For years, he was just a rumor. No one saw him. No one heard from him. The world moved on. Then, on April 5, 2002, the silence ended. His body was found in his Seattle home, a syringe nearby. He had been dead for 2 weeks. He was just 34. His death echoed Kurt Cobain's, happening on the same date 8 years later. But unlike Cobain, there was no media frenzy, no grand farewell, just a lonely end for a man whose voice once shook the world. 11. Scott Weiland. Had everything: talent, looks, and attitude. As the singer of Stone Temple Pilots, he ruled the 90s with hit songs like Plush, Interstate Love Song, and Vaseline. His voice helped define a generation. But behind the fame, he was struggling. Another substance and a substance weren't just bad habits. They controlled his life. His addiction was no secret. He got arrested, went to rehab, and lost relationships. The band tried to keep going, but the chaos was too much. He was fired. That could have been the end, but he didn't quit. In the early 2000s, he joined Velvet Revolver with ex-Guns N' Roses members. Their first album was a huge success, proving he still had star power. But his old problems didn't go away. The substances, the reckless behavior, it all caught up to him again. He was fired, again. His solo career never took off, and when Stone Temple Pilots gave him another chance, it ended badly. His performances got worse. His strong voice became weak. His body, once full of energy, looked worn out. Years of substance dependency had taken their toll, but he refused to stop. Then, on December 3, 2015, it was over. He was found dead on his tour bus. The cause, an overdose of a substance, alcohol, and MDA. His heart was already weak from years of dependencia. He was 48. To those who followed his story, his death wasn't a shock. It had been coming for a long time. 12. Paul Gray wasn't just another bass player. He was the foundation of Slipknot. As a founding member, he helped create their aggressive, chaotic sound. Behind the mask, he was the quiet force that kept the band together. But inside, he was battling something he couldn't beat. Analgésicos, opiates, what started as relief from the pain of touring, turned into an addiction he couldn't escape. While his bandmates roared on stage, he suffered in silence. His addiction was no secret, but fixing it wasn't easy. He went to rehab, but nothing worked. Even as Slipknot's fame grew, his body was breaking down. His wife saw it. His bandmates saw it. He missed rehearsals. He looked sick, but he kept pushing until he couldn't. 13. Hillel Slovak. His guitar wasn't just an instrument. It was part of him. His mix of funk and rock gave the Red Hot Chili Peppers their unique sound. Born in Israel in the early 60s, he moved to the U.S. as a child and quickly found his passion for music. With Flea, he co-founded the band and brought energy and creativity to their songs. His playing wasn't just skilled, it was electric. Every note he played made their music unforgettable. But as the band got bigger, something dark took over his life. Opiates. At first, it was just another part of the rock star life, but soon it controlled him. He and Anthony Kiedis fed off each other's habits, trapped in a cycle of highs and crashes. The signs were there: missed rehearsals, sloppy performances, and sudden disappearances during tours. The band was on the edge of success, but he was falling behind. His talent was still there, but his addiction made him unreliable. Friends and bandmates tried to help, but addiction is a tough fight. Some days his music was brilliant. Other days he was too lost in substances to play well. He was caught between two worlds, music and opiates, and the gap between them grew wider. By the time the Uplift Mofo party plan got attention, he was losing his fight. His friends tried to save him, but addiction doesn't let go easily. In the summer of 1988, it finally won. He was found dead in his apartment, opiates still in his system. He was only 26. 14. Shannon Hoon. His voice had a way of standing out in the 90s. The Blind Melon frontman wasn't just another grunge singer. His mix of folk, rock, and psychedelia made his band unique. Born in the late 60s, he grew up in Indiana, dreaming of fame. When he met Axl Rose, his life changed. Singing backup on Use Your Illusion gave him a taste of the rock star world, and soon after, Blind Melon was born. Their first album blew up in the early 90s, and No Rain made them famous overnight. But fame came with trouble. His substance use, once just fun, became a daily habit. Stimulants and alcohol fueled his performances, but they were destroying him. His bandmates saw him falling apart. They tried everything, even hiring a counselor to keep him sober, but nothing worked. He was talented, but unpredictable. Sometimes his voice was pure magic. Other times he mumbled lyrics or walked off stage mid-show. Fans loved him, but those close to him saw the truth. Fame, pressure, and addiction were crushing him. By the time Blind Melon recorded Soup, he was spiraling. His erratic behavior made recording difficult, and his body was breaking down. Then, in October 1995, the band's tour bus pulled into a new city, but he never stepped off. 15. Nick Drake. He never fit the image of a rock star. Quiet, shy, and thoughtful, he was born in England in the late 1940s with a gift for music, but few people noticed at the time. His soft guitar playing and sad lyrics spoke of loneliness and longing. With each album, 5 Leaves Left, Brighter Later, and Pink Moon, he poured his heart into his songs. But instead of fame, he found himself alone. Critics liked his work, but the public barely listened. This gap between his talent and success made him feel invisible. The world wasn't ready for his sad music. His albums didn't sell well, and he lost confidence. Depression weighed him down like a heavy cloud. By the time he made Pink Moon, he barely spoke to anyone. The album was stripped down to just him and his guitar, reflecting his lonely state of mind. He moved back home with his parents, sinking deeper into his thoughts. Music, once his escape, now felt like a burden. He felt lost, as it was if the world had forgotten him. The weight of his struggles became too much to bear. Then, one cold November morning in 1974, the silence became permanent. He was found in his bedroom, an overdose of antidepressants in his system. He was only 26. No one knows for sure if it was an accident or not, but either way, his voice was gone. At the time, few people noticed his death. His records were forgotten, his name barely mentioned. 16. GG Allin. By the late 1970s, opiates was as much a part of Allin as his music. He talked about pushing limits, about going further than anyone else. But in the end, substances took him before he could take himself. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, he fell deeper into crime and addiction, going in and out of prison. His behavior became more extreme. He promised a shocking final act, a public death like no other. But when the end came, it was quieter than he had planned. On a summer night in 1993, after his last performance, Allin went on a substance-fueled rampage. Hours later, opiates ended his life at 36. Even in death, the chaos continued. His funeral became a bizarre party, his body displayed like a trophy. Some call him punk's last outlaw. Others see only a man destroyed by addiction. 17. Richard Manuel. Some voices never fade, even after their owners are gone. Richard Manuel had one of those voices, soft, full of feeling, and heavy with sadness. As a key member of the band, he gave life to songs that felt like quiet confessions. But behind the music, he was falling apart, trapped by addiction and despair. Born in the early 1940s, he was a natural talent. The band became legends, their songs unforgettable. But fame brought pressure, and Manuel struggled to handle it. By the 1970s, alcohol and stimulants were always with him. The highs didn't last, and the lows got worse. When the band played their big farewell concert in 1976, it should have been a celebration. Instead, it marked the start of his downfall. In the years that followed, he tried to fight his addictions, but each victory was short-lived. He kept trying to come back, but the darkness kept pulling him under. On a night in early 1986, after another show, he went to his hotel room and took his own life. He was only 42. 18. Chris Bell. He was ahead of his time. A dreamer, a perfectionist, an artist always reaching for something just out of grasp. He helped shape the sound of Big Star, a band that would later inspire generations. But in his own lifetime, success always seemed just out of reach. With every failure, his struggles grew heavier. Born in the early 1950s in Memphis, he found comfort in music, inspired by the Beatles. When Big Star's first album flopped commercially despite great reviews, he took it hard. He saw it as a personal failure. The doubt ate away at him. Substances, barbiturates, opiates, anything to ease the pain, became an escape. He left Big Star early and drifted, making music filled with sorrow and longing. But no one was listening, and his struggles only deepened. 19. Danny Whitten. He had a voice that could shake your soul and a guitar that could make you feel every note. As part of Crazy Horse, the band that backed Neil Young, Danny Whitten helped shape a sound that blended rock, blues, and country into something raw and real. Born in the early 1940s, he had the kind of talent that made every song feel like a confession. His work on Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere made tracks like Cinnamon Girl legendary. But behind the music, he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. As Crazy Horse rose to fame, he fell deeper into opiates addiction. It made him unreliable, distant, and weak. Rehearsals became impossible, performances suffered, and soon even his closest friends couldn't reach him. By the early 1970s, he was supposed to go on a major tour with Neil Young, but he was too far gone. Young, heartbroken but out of options, sent him home with some cash and a plane ticket. That same night, he was found dead, a lethal mix of substances and alcohol shutting his body down forever. He was just 29. Neil Young carried that loss for years, pouring his grief into The Needle and The Damage Done, a song that still haunts listeners today. Whitten's voice, once so full of life, was gone too soon. His death was a harsh lesson. Addiction doesn't just take lives, it steals futures, robbing the world of what could have. 20. Brent Mydland. He had a rare talent. His keyboard playing gave the Grateful Dead a fresh sound, and his voice added deep emotion to their music. Born in the early 1950s, Brent Mydland grew up loving music and joined the band in the late 1970s. For over 10 years, he played in packed stadiums, his voice floating through the air as fans swayed to the music. But behind the bright lights, his life was falling apart. Substances were common in the Grateful Dead's world, but for him, they became a heavy burden. The never-ending tours, the pressure to perform, and the chaos of fame made it worse. Opiates and stimulants became his escape, but over time, the damage showed. His voice lost its strength, his hands shook on the keys, and even his closest friends saw him slipping away. He tried to quit many times, but addiction kept pulling him back. Then came the summer of 1990. The band had just finished another tour, and he was back home in California. Instead of finding peace, he met his end. A deadly mix of opiates and stimulants stopped his heart. He was only 37. 21. Pete Doherty. Once the bright hope of British rock, Pete Doherty's lyrics spoke about love, rebellion, and life's messiness, making him a major voice of the early 2000s. As part of the Libertines, he helped create songs that captured the restless energy of a generation. But his music wasn't the only thing that made headlines. His substance use became just as famous. At first, his wild behavior was part of the charm. He lived the rock star life, reckless, free, and unpredictable. But soon, substances took over. Opiates and stimulants turned him into a shadow of himself. He missed shows, disappeared for days, and pushed away those who cared about him. His friendship with Carl Barat, his partner in the Libertines, fell apart. The band couldn't keep going while he was out of control, so they broke up. Even after starting Baby Shambles and going solo, his addiction followed him. His high-profile romance with supermodel Kate Moss kept him in the tabloids, but behind the glamour was a man falling apart. Arrests, failed rehab attempts, and public meltdowns turned him into a cautionary tale. His performances became unpredictable, sometimes brilliant, sometimes a disaster. 22. Steven Adler. Drumming helped make Guns N' Roses legendary, and Steven Adler's beats powered classics like Welcome to the Jungle and Sweet Child O' Mine, turning them into rock anthems. But as the band climbed to success, he sank, drowning in an opiates addiction that nearly ended his life. By the time the band was working on their next big project, Adler was out of control. He showed up late to rehearsals, nodded off in the studio, and couldn't keep up. Even in a band known for partying, his substance use stood out. His bandmates tried to help, pushing him into rehab, but nothing worked. By the early 1990s, Guns N' Roses had no choice. They fired him. Losing the band wasn't his lowest point. That came later. His opiates use got worse, leading to a stroke in the mid-90s that left him partially paralyzed and slurring his words. The hands that once commanded the drums barely worked. He spent years bouncing between rehab centers, trying to rebuild his life, but the damage was permanent. Occasionally, he would join his old band for guest performances, but the magic was gone. The drummer who helped shape a generation became a grim warning. Talent alone isn't enough to escape addiction. 23. Wayne Kramer. Guitar wasn't just something Wayne Kramer played. It was something he made come alive. As a founding member of MC5, he helped start the punk movement. His music was pure rebellion, full of energy. But when the band fell apart, he didn't just fade away. He fell into substances and crime. The 1970s should have been his comeback, but instead he lost control. Without a band or a stable life, he turned to substance dealing to survive. He wasn't just using substances, he was selling them, feeding the addiction that was ruining him. Eventually, it caught up to him. In the mid-70s, an undercover cop set him up, and he ended up in prison for years, his guitar replaced by prison walls. In prison, he met other musicians who tried to help him get back on track. But when he was released, the punk scene he helped create had moved on without him. He tried to make solo music and speak out against the prison system, but the damage was done. He could never again be the legend he once was. His story shows that rebellion without control leads to destruction. 24. Blake Judd. With Knocked Mystium, Blake Judd wasn't just a musician. He was a trailblazer. He transformed black metal into something new by blending it with psychedelic, industrial, and post-rock elements. His music shocked and amazed, but his personal life fell apart. His addiction didn't just wreck his career, it destroyed his reputation. As opiates took over, his performances worsened. He missed shows, abandoned projects, and pushed away fans. The worst came when he started selling band merchandise and rare records online, taking money from fans and never sending the items. When people found out, the backlash was huge. As the lead singer of the 13th Floor Elevators, Roky Erickson was a true artist, a voice that could touch your soul with lyrics that twisted reality. He helped create the psychedelic sound of the 1960s. His music was like a dream, and his voice felt like a scream from another world. But the same substances that sparked his creativity also hurt him deeply. By the late 1960s, he started to lose himself. He became paranoid, thinking he was talking to beings from other worlds. Then he was arrested. Texas didn't show mercy to substance users, and a simple cannabis charge led to a 10-year sentence. His only way out was an insanity plea, but that only led to worse things. He was sent to Rusk State Hospital, where he was treated with electroshock therapy and strong sedatives, which only worsened his mental state. He went in a troubled musician and came out a shadow of himself. When he was released in the 1970s, the world had moved on. He tried to return to music, but his mind was broken. He often talked about dark forces controlling him. He lived alone, with his thoughts constantly in chaos. The substances and treatments had taken away something he could never get back.